You're listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. This is the show that talks about identity and access management and making sure you know who has access to what. Let's get started. Welcome to the Identity at the Center podcast. I'm Jeff, and that's Jim. Hey, Jim.
Hey, Jeff. How are you?
Oh, not so bad. Yourself?
Good. It's going to be a busy day. We've got a lot on the sports calendar in terms of TV watching, but I've also got a lot of, household chores to do because tomorrow I'm going to start my journey out to San Francisco for the Oktane conference.
Yeah. So it's we're recording this on Saturday, November 5th. So I've just gotten back from a week-long trip to scenic Elkhart, Indiana. We'll talk about that maybe real quickly. And then, we're going to be at Oktane next week. So you're traveling out tomorrow, Sunday. I'm flying out Monday. For you and I, it's kind of like an all-day thing. Although we do get back like 3 hours because of the time changes.
Well, we actually get another hour because,
that's right. Yeah.
because it's fall back.
I totally forgot about that. Yeah, so we're going to gain an hour, hours all over the place. So we'll be tired at like 6 o'clock in the evening.
Did you ever notice how annoyed people who live in Phoenix get? And I think there's an area of Indiana that doesn't recognize daylight savings time, and they're right. I mean, I think it's kind of from a bygone era. But I guess it's the logistics of getting rid of it that's probably more difficult than just maintaining it.
Yeah, I keep hearing it, at least in the U.S., they're going to... It's always like, we're thinking about getting rid of it next year or something like that. But it is from a relic from a bygone era. It was originally marketed as something that the farmers wanted, and that's not the truth at all. It was something else. It was just... It kind of got blamed on farming for some reason, but that's not the reason why.
I didn't know that, but I've always thought like those darn farmers making their kids get up at 5 a.m. and milk the cows.
Yeah, it was not. Yeah, it's funny. I learned that one recently. It was like, why do we have this thing? And it was not the farmers at all. It was some sort of PR thing that sort of blamed it on the farmers. So,
I've got a funny side story if we got a minute.
Yeah, let's do it.
I grew up in Philadelphia, in the inner city, and when I went to college, it was Millersville University, which is in Lancaster County, and I was sitting in a freshman year political science class. I don't even remember what I was saying, but some guy raised his hand and looked at me and was like, "You city people don't care about the farmers at all," and it was like, whoa. Maybe he's right. It's not that I didn't care about the farmers, but maybe I was coming off that way. Mm-hmm. And so it was a learning experience. I think that goes, I'm sure I'm not breaking any big news for people here, but it's like about flexibility and being willing to learn and challenge your perspectives throughout your life. I think when you get to the point where you're not willing to do that, you're done learning.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think it's probably just that awareness thing, right? If you're never brought into contact with stuff, how are you even supposed to know about it? That's why I love travel, and I think it's one of the things that I recommend everybody is travel, go see the world, all the different cultures, peoples, nations, all that stuff. I'm an optimist, so I like to believe most people are good and just trying to get by with their own different lives. But go out and see the world and get out of your little corner is a big eye opener. I always kind of reference it back. My first trip to India, I want to say it was like 2008, maybe it was 2010. I don't remember. Someone now was a big eye opener for me. It was kind of like my first international trip. It was like, oh, okay. There is more to the world than just, Chicago area and the United States, right? And things like that. And, I had done some travel around there before, but that was sort of like the first kind of like, oh, okay, there's some things out there that I want to check out.
Yeah, that was definitely true. So, but speaking of travel, so we'll be in San Francisco next week, which has always been one of my favorite parts of the country. Between just the Bay Area, but also like the wine region. It's just, to me, it's kind of like heaven on earth in terms of, all those wineries and ranches and everything. It's just, I love it, but also really just looking forward to the conference. There's a slate of speakers who are, not even just in the identity and access management space. So Serena Williams, Magic Johnson are going to be speakers, and of course a lot of the executives from Okta as well as some of their partner companies. I'm just really looking forward to learning a lot and being around people who are thinking about IAM in the future, not just IAM now, but IAM in the future.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting and fun. I think I definitely want to give a shout out to really multiple people at Okta team, but they've really been welcoming and really kind of helping us get it set up for this, including making introductions with some folks that we don't want to put names out there yet, but we're going to have multiple podcast episodes. I think right now the plan is to probably have something for like Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, maybe into the following week as well. So we'll see how it goes. It's kind of like our modus operandi for when we hit a conference. But definitely want to give a shout out to Steven Strong. He's been like a super advocate for us, and totally appreciate that. I think last time we talked about this, he talked about his getting into his 15 minutes of fame. So we'll give him another few minutes towards that credit. So yeah, thanks so much, Steven, and definitely others. So as we get things kind of lined up this week, I'm sure we'll have a whole bunch of people to thank, and yeah, that'll be cool. So yeah, and you mentioned some of the folks that'll be there, like Serena Williams and Magic Johnson. That's kind of cool, right? I think you go to a conference and it's like, oh, okay. It's great to hear, from like, so and so product person, whatever, or like some speaker in the industry. But it's always a treat when you get to, hear stories that are really outside of like the industry, right? So I'm curious to see what Venus and Magic are going to talk about.
Well, it's not Venus, it's Serena.
Oh, Serena, that's right. Yeah.
But, I think I think so. Just name dropping those two, they're not going to be on the podcast.
It'd be cool, but I don't know what we would talk about. Yeah.
Well, I think we would figure something out if they decide they want to be on the podcast.
Yeah.
The invitation is open. I just think that they probably get a nice speaker fee, and the Identity at the Center podcast is yet to reach the level of which we pay speaker fees.
Hey, you never know. Serena, Magic, if you guys are listening, you're like, hey, you want to come on the world famous Identity and Access Management podcast, hit us up on LinkedIn. There we go.
Yeah, there you go. Offers open.
What else we got going on? So you had a conversation with Gerry Gebel, a friend of the show from Strata Identity Orchestration, easy for me to say. And you guys talked about IDQL, which is Identity Query Language, and the Hexa project, which is this open source policy orchestrator for multi-cloud, which is pretty cool. We're going to play that interview sort of like to end this show because it's about 25 minutes, I think, something like that. So that's kind of like coming up, but I think it certainly has a nice kind of like dovetail into like where things are going, especially when we start talking about authentication and multi-cloud and things like that. And I think you did a roundtable recently where maybe something like that came up, right?
Yeah, so I was on this Connex roundtable, and it was really cool. I didn't know what to expect, but the participants were, the IAM practitioners, folks who listen to this podcast, same kind of, daily responsibilities. And one of the questions that was asked at the end was, if you had the magic wand, what IAM thing would you create? And, one of the folks described, I think, the exact thing that Strata, what the identity orchestration looks to solve. And so, not making a Strata commercial here, but, it validated to me that, people out there need a tool for, and this is what identity orchestration is all about, is, coming up with an abstraction layer or a platform where you connect identity services like your single sign-on multi-factor tools along with legacy technologies and applications that are in your cloud infrastructure. But like I said, that kind of like validated to me that this identity orchestration is something that people actually need. There were a couple other things that had come up in that whole dialogue as well, which was one that really jumped out at me was the piece around IAM policy. So not like policy orchestration. I'm not talking about technical policies, but the Microsoft Word documents or the PDFs of like, this is what thou shalt do as an enterprise employee or an application or things like that. And I think one of the things that folks struggle with is, balancing, okay, we have all these compliance requirements, but we also have legal requirements, and then we have security best practices, and we want to meld all those things into our policies. And then the question or the goal from there is to drive enforcement. So how are we getting, first the knowledge that folks are actually using these platforms, or complying with the policies, and then how do we increase the compliance with our own policies? And it's just, as you know, something that we've been, solving in our IAM strategy development for a long time. We talked about a framework. And so I was able to kind of contribute that to the group, which is, hey, this might not be the one and only answer, but this is how we've solved this in the past, which is really like, first off, using those policies as a way to drive adoption of your IAM platforms by saying, if you're using our single sign-on, if you're using our PAM and our IGA, the IAM program offering of those technologies, well, then you're checkbox compliant across all of these policies that we're driving, the password policy, things like that. And so that was kind of one of the things that I was able to contribute, was that you can get to that. And then, where you don't have compliance, you do need to check, and folks that are out of compliance, that, in other words, not following your corporate security or IAM policies, it's kind of like I don't have a better way to put it, but name and shame. So kind of like, identify, put a spotlight on that. This is where we're not compliant. This is where we're not following our own policies.
Yeah, I think it sounds like a good conversation. It sounds to me also like maybe it was something very specific to a specific group of people. So this is not something that's like publicly available that people can check out.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the way these
membership has its privileges.
Membership has its privileges, but I think if anybody's interested, I can certainly link them into the folks at Connex so they can be invited to future events. Just reach out to me on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I did something similar for the Retail and Hospitality ISOC group, Information Sharing and Analysis Center. Talked about ransomware and identity, and that's one of those things where it's a similar, actually, kind of an updated version of the presentation that you ditched me on at last year's Authenticate, talking about smart IAM to reduce ransomware. So kind of updated a version of that. So
if you're in the
now we're even. So if you're in the retail and hospitality industry, definitely check out rhisac.org. It's a great group of folks that really kind of come together to kind of share information around information security in general, around retail and hospitality industries. So might be something worth checking out. Lots of good folks over there, and membership has the privileges. You can check out a replay of the webinar I did on that. So we're gonna go ahead.
I did want to mention one other thing, which is I kind of feel like it's in our nature. We're both 20 years in this industry that we're really focused on giving back. So it's between this podcast and doing events like that. But I also don't think you have to be in the industry for 20 years to give back. I wanted to give a shout out to Andrew Chanthafone. Did I get his last name right? Chanthafone?
You did. You got it.
I nailed it for a change. But he's put out a LinkedIn class that he led, and I've really, just more or less been following it on his LinkedIn post. I haven't actually gone out and done the training yet, but shout out to Andrew, because I think the first time we talked to him, he was kind of new in the industry and trying to give back at kind of this early stage in his career. And it's really admirable that he's doing that. He's putting himself out there. He's not afraid to, make a mistake or something like that. And I think that's a good leadership, whatever
good quality.
Good quality to have, right? There you go.
Yeah. I mean, putting yourself out there is not easy, right? We do this podcast, doing it for a while. Every time is a journey, but my hat's off to anybody who produces content for other people to consume. Doesn't matter what it is. Every one of those folks are putting themselves out there, and yeah, sometimes it's good content, sometimes it's not, right? And if they're, you can get easily kind of bogged down in the details, especially if you're wrong on something. And I think it's okay to be aware that, yeah, you're probably going to make a mistake at some point. And as long as you're willing to own up to it and be like, yeah, okay, yeah, let me correct that or change my way of thinking or whatever, what it looks like. That's cool too. So I think, the more people who are out there contributing, and Andrew is certainly one of them. I'm excited to see what he's got next. He's got another class that he's working on. I didn't want to spoil his thunder, so I've invited him. It's like, hey, when you're ready, let's publicize it on our podcast. And he's got his LinkedIn channel, but there are others that are doing the same. And yeah, I think having more viewpoints in the world that people can consume and take as a data point for their own decision making just makes everyone smarter, and makes it easier for everybody to get better, every day. So totally agree with that one.
Yeah, Andrew's been on a mission to bring more people into the industry. I saw, Bill Nelson put out the ID Pro monthly newsletter email, and he cited a statistic where the IAM industry is expected to double in the next 5 years from 13 billion to 26 billion. It's not too late to join the party, folks.
That's exactly right. Yeah. I'd love to see more content around the business side of IAM. I think there's lots of technical training and sort of like, here's how to do X inside of Y application. What I don't see a lot is sort of like all the intangibles that sit between sort of like the engineering aspect and sort of like the information of how to do things, and the real world, right? How do you get buy-in from the business? How do you, run an IAM program? How do you, what are some things to think about if you're establishing policies and procedures or standards or things like that? So I think that's something that, we might see some uptick in the next couple of years. I don't want to spoil any things that we might be, working on, but that is an area that I think more people contributing to, the better for everybody.
Absolutely.
All right, so let's get to your conversation you had with Gerry. But before we do that, I mentioned that I was in the RV capital of the world, Elkhart, Indiana, I think earlier on. I didn't realize that it was the RV capital of the world. I guess I kind of knew in the back of my head because I've kind of lived in the Chicago area for so long. But did you know that there is a RV slash manufactured housing or manufactured home Hall of Fame?
I was not aware of that.
Yeah, so it is across the street from RSM offices in Elkhart. Yeah, I have not been to it, but I wasn't aware that there was such a thing.
Yeah, I mean, there's, one thing that I've found out is that there are so many different manufacturers of RVs and motorhomes. I had a Jayco brand, and one of the big trends right now is that there are sites that are kind of like Airbnbs for RVs. So if you have one that's in decent condition, you can rent it out, which I think is super cool.
You just park it on a lot of land and you've kind of got almost like a tiny home, right?
Yeah, well, most people, no, it's not even to leave it on land. I mean, the idea is that people can actually drive it and take it places. Yeah, and so, I think that most people who have RVs, at least when I had an RV, it's like use it a couple times a year, and for the most part, you're paying insurance and maintenance and all, and taxes, basically registration taxes, for it to sit there and not get used. So if you're able to rent it out and recoup some of that money, and also, I mean, I think one of the great things about Airbnb is not only the fact that you can make money from from renting out your place, but also that somebody else gets to enjoy it and somebody else gets to build their experiences there. So, I think it's kind of contributing to the good in the world.
So it's got me thinking, we usually do a lighter note at the end, but we're going to end this episode with your conversation with Gerry. Let's do that now. What does your perfect RV look like?
So I had an RV, like I mentioned. It was a Class C, but it was 40 foot. It was too big. It was like it was not even a little home. It was a big home on wheels. So it definitely have to be smaller, more maneuverable, and it would have to have, either some kind of vehicle that came out of the side or that you drag behind it, because if you're going to have that kind of motorhome, then actually I think I would just, rather than that, is pull something behind. But I definitely would like to get on the electric trend. Okay, so the main point, this is what I really wanted to say about my dream RV would be that the worst part of having an RV is doing the sewer. It's disgusting. You have like basically this long tube that you hook from the side of your RV into this drain pipe, and you have to like drain out your black water, which is the worst stuff, and then flush it out with your gray water. It's like a process that you go through to basically clean out your sewage tank. It's disgusting. And if you have any kind of mistake, and you better put on plastic gloves every time, because the one time that you don't, you're going to get some sewage on your hands, and it doesn't just wash off. It stinks.
You're not really helping me want to do this very much. But I was thinking like I'm the same. Like I want something that's easy, and I think something that is like an electrified version of a RV of some sort would be kind of cool. Yeah, I want the bells and whistles. Like I want Wi-Fi. I want to basically have like a hotel room on wheels. It's kind of how that I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, I actually had a VW Vanagon back in the 90s, and they were built mostly in the 80s. It was like, look, you don't have the shower and the toilet, but most campgrounds have those things. So if you're willing to use public stuff for that, I mean, it's really convenient because you can park it in a normal parking spot, and it's got a cool factor too.
Yeah, VW has their updated ID.Buzz. It's their electrified little VW van type thing coming out.
Coming out, but you know what? They've been talking about that coming out for like decades now. I mean, seriously,
I think it's close. I think it's like within the next year or so. It's already being driven around and sort of tested. So
it will be sold out constantly. You'll have to
every
put your order in.
Sold out.
Yeah, that's true. But even if it wasn't, even if electric vehicles weren't going the way they are, VW stuff has just so much demand. I'm surprised they haven't released it sooner.
Yeah, I don't know. Okay. Anything else before we hear from yourself and Gerry?
No, I'm going to be rooting for my Georgia Bulldogs today and the Philadelphia Phillies because I'm not a Houston Astros fan. So let the hate mail flow.
So Phillies and I guess anti-Astros is how your position is.
Yeah, and I like the Bulldogs over the Volunteers of Tennessee.
And I have zero positions on either. Let's get into your conversation with Gerry. Thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see everybody at Oktane in a few days.
I'm here with Gerry Gebel, head of standards at Strata Identity. Hi, Gerry.
Hey, Jim. Great to be back with you.
Great to have you again. We saw each other at Gartner recently, and it was great to see you. And we decided we needed to catch back up. This is your second time on the Identity at the Center podcast. So, the normal routine is we ask you, how did you get into identity? But since we already got that story from you, and anyone who's interested in checking that out, they should go back to that episode. My question more is, what's new for you since the last time you were on the podcast? I know there were some new things getting started, and hopefully you have an update for us.
Yeah, I sure do, and I know we'll get into that as we continue here. But yes, it was great to see you at the Gartner Identity Conference. It reminded me of my first visit to the first Gartner Identity Conference back in the day. I think it was circa 2006 or 7. I was at Burton Group at the time, and I tried to get Gartner to give me a comp ticket to the show, just because we wanted to check it out. Of course, identity had been a big part of the Burton Group Catalyst conferences for many years. And I guess Gartner had got an idea, hey, this is a big thing, we should get into it as well. But it was interesting to see their show the first time around. And, it's definitely one of the better identity conferences in the industry these days. So it's definitely a must see for folks that want to see and hear what Gartner's thinking about on the identity landscape.
Yeah, one of my favorite things about that conference is that you meet a lot of people who are new to the space, who are trying to wrap their brains around it. And I think Gartner does a really good job of kind of, making things understandable for folks who are, coming from a different perspective, maybe other parts of IT or other parts of the business, and trying to wrap their brains around this thing of what is identity access management.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And there were several really good presentations by some of the analysts, and definitely enjoyed that part of the event. But you also asked, what's new here on the front lines of identity orchestration and what we've been working on. I think last year when we spoke might have been the first public mention of the identity query language standard that we've been working on. So that's been my focus at
People like to
Strata.
come on this podcast to break big news. So,
Well,
yeah.
if you want to say you heard it here first, it's actually true. So kudos to you guys for wanting to learn more about that. But since then, we've been doing a lot of work on the project, a lot of work on the open source part of it that we call Hexa, Hexa. And I guess the other big news is that over this past summer, the CNCF, the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, accepted IDQL and Hexa as a sandbox project. So that's a huge milestone for us.
Congratulations on that. That took a lot of work, I'm sure. One of the things that we like to do with the podcast is not lose people too quickly, right? So maybe when we start at the basics is Strata Identity is solving a problem. The solution is called identity orchestration, but the problem is really around this multi-cloud, multi-IDP situation that so many companies are in. It's not just big multinational conglomerate corporations, but it's even mid-sized companies. So maybe talk about that problem a little bit and what you guys do with the identity orchestration to kind of solve it.
Absolutely. Yeah, identity orchestration is really a new technique, a new technology within the identity industry these days. It's Strata is the one really to identify this as something new and different and to invent the concept. And it's really about building an abstraction layer between your applications and all of the identity infrastructure that those applications consume. And primarily we talk about IDPs, identity providers or authentication providers and things of that nature. But yeah, it's this abstraction that decouples your apps from the identity functions so that you can do a lot of more flexible things today with software that you could not do previously. If you wanted to modernize the authentication of an application, you actually had to rewrite that part of the app. For example, if you want to add MFA or passwordless to existing applications, it's really difficult to modernize them in that way because maybe some of them weren't even built for SAML. Maybe a lot of legacy applications that are very important to businesses still use things like LDAP authentication. So how can you break that bind and modernize that to use something like OpenID Connect, and in addition, add on MFA or passwordless where needed. So that's what an identity orchestration abstraction layer can accomplish, because you connect the IDPs, the MFA, and other identity functions to the fabric, to the abstraction layer. And the orchestration is the sort of the flow of what happens when a session is initiated. I'm a business user trying to access a certain application. Which IDP should I go to? For certain parts of that application, maybe they're more sensitive. I need to use a step-up authentication or MFA. And again, the identity orchestration layer can manage that sort of session flow until ultimately, get the application the information it needs to properly establish the user session.
Yeah, that abstraction layer. I mean, that seems to be the such a common architectural principle now, and how you take legacy applications, infrastructure, and kind of integrate them with modern technologies. And it sounds like really that's what the identity orchestration is really about, and it provides that Rosetta Stone, because that's the hard part, right? It's like, it's, when I think about all of these applications, they all are not only applications but platforms, etc. They all have their own way of integrating, communicating, providing authentication. So it's the identity orchestration layer, from what I understand, that provides that Rosetta Stone, so that you as a practitioner, you as a company, don't have to solve this for all of the platforms that you need to integrate.
That's right, because when we talk to customers, so many of them have hundreds of applications, maybe a few thousand. So if you think about incorporating passwordless for each of them, you don't have enough time or resources or budget to accomplish that. But instead, the orchestration layer connects to the applications, and you connect the MFA or passwordless or the IDP to the orchestration layer, and we can coordinate, we can broker those interactions in a much more efficient way. So that's what Strata and identity orchestration are all about.
I'm going to ask you a trick question here. Because we talk about this term legacy.
Yes.
Yeah. When we talk about this term legacy, I know at one point in my career, it meant one thing and one thing only, which was the green screen. Nowadays, I mean, you could talk about certainly any kind of Corba or Java applications even, but more like web-enabled applications, maybe header-based authentication. So how far back can you go? I mean, when are you talking about you can even integrate the green screens into some of these IDPs, or is it's just not possible with the technology?
Yeah, it's a wide range of technology, of application technologies that can be supported. Definitely header-based apps, that's sort of table stakes. You need to be able to bring those older applications that still have a lot of business value. You need to continue to bring them forward into the modern way of managing them. And so there's definitely techniques for dealing with them, and Kerberos-based apps, for example.
Yeah, I remember kind of some of my earlier projects in my IT career was, building web interfaces to mainframe applications. And, those were not fun projects. A lot of screen scraping and stuff going on in the background.
Sure. Yeah, and they're still out there, right? The mainframes will be out there for quite a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. So you had mentioned the updates to the new standards. Would you kind of give a little bit more background on what those standards are all about, and kind of what the process is like that you're going through? Because you're the head of standards. What does it mean to kind of develop a standard and get people to buy into it? What's that whole process like? But maybe first start with just the update on those two particular standards.
Sure. Yeah, so we talked about identity orchestration here. How do you deal with applications deployed across multiple clouds, and still hybrid deployments, dealing with multiple IDPs and other kinds of authentication and attribute providers. If we think about policy orchestration, it's sort of the flip side of that, because each cloud platform, each major cloud platform has its own way of defining access policy and how they enforce it. And this is true also up and down the stack, from the application to the infrastructure and platform to the data level, and even to networks, and zero trust network access. So you have all of these different policy formats, and think about, how difficult it is to manage that just, from a staffing perspective. You need skill sets now in all of these different areas, because each of those systems manages access in primarily a proprietary way. And then also how difficult it is to really govern that sort of complex environment. Who has access to what? It's still a very difficult question to answer. So when we looked at this space, we came up with the idea of identity query language, or IDQL, as a way to generically define the access policy. So it's a declarative format that's meant to describe, the vast majority of use cases, but it's not, just to be clear, it's not a runtime policy decisioning or enforcement mechanism. It's a way to define policy in a generic format And then the Hexa software that I mentioned before, Hexa is an open source software project that implements IDQL and translates that IDQL into the bespoke or imperative format of the target system. So you can imagine that over time, as we have more and more integrations and connections available, you'll be able to bring in more and more access policies from these different target systems and be able to manage them in a single way, be able to do reporting, analytics, governance on them, and also just use the power of the Hexa and IDQL model to manage many target systems in a uniform and consistent way. So that's what that's why we came up with the idea of this project. And folks at Strata, from our founders and management team, they were part of the SAML definition way back in the day, right? So we have folks here that were co-authors of SAML. So it's really in our DNA to support and really invest in industry standards. And we felt strongly enough that this is not something just that Strata should consume, but that it should be part of an industry-wide effort to try to address some of these challenges that customers are facing.
So SAML's a standard that really took off, right? I think if you're listening to this podcast, you're probably well familiar with SAML. What does it take to get that kind of, ubiquity in a standard?
Yeah, it does take a lot of effort, a lot of coordination and time commitment. So what we did was, we started out writing, the baseline white paper, if you will, describing what IDQL consisted of. And we started looking around and talking to customers and partners and seeing who was interested to, get in at the start and really help to build this out. So we talked to a lot of customer organizations about, some of their issues, and the concept definitely resonated with them. They saw this as a challenge that really was unmet by a lot of the primary vendors in the space today, and so we use the customer view here to help build the impetus and the momentum behind the effort. And we also started building the Hexa open source software because we weren't starting out to just define a specification. Pretty much anyone can do that, but we wanted to show that it could actually work. So that's why we have the Hexa open source project as a component of this whole project, is to show that we can take, IDQL and convert it to, the Google Cloud Platform format or Azure's or AWS, that we can connect to those platforms and using their public APIs to discover what application resources are there within a domain or a project, what access policies are already defined, pull them in, translate them to the IDQL format. Now we've got, many applications, many systems in the administrative view, so we can manage them from there. We can make changes to that policy and then retranslate it to the imperative or bespoke format of the target system and use orchestration to push that out there and activate it. And again, I'll reinforce that we don't replace the runtime decision or enforcement functions. We are just an administrative function of managing the access policy itself.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's just that Rosetta Stone that we talked about.
Right, right. So we got, so we developed this working group. We started working on the open source. We built out and wrote the first edition of the specification. And earlier this year, we submitted a proposal into the Cloud Native Computing Foundation because we wanted to be part of an industry or organization that was vendor neutral, that had all of the protections, of intellectual property and so on, so that as new contributors came onto the project, they would have the comfort or the confidence of being within that sort of intellectual property regime. And then early in the summer, we got approval for a sandbox project, as I mentioned earlier. So now we're opening up the working group membership to more and more people, bringing more and more folks into the project. And, we're just continuing onward and upward and trying to build, more momentum and, eventually get to that point where we see IDQL being a common standard implemented in the industry.
Yeah. To me, that seems like that's the mark of success. It's kind of like when you have a child, you raise the child, then they move out of your house and they go live their own life. That is kind of like success on child rearing. And it seems like
Right.
developing a standard, you're evangelizing it, you're bringing other people into the fold. At some point, it kind of goes off and lives a life of its own.
It does. Ultimately, it has to go out into the wild on its own and stand on its own merits. You're right. You're right about that.
So I know we had Gary Rowe on the
Yes.
on the podcast a couple weeks back. He's running the Chrysalis conference, and you're going to be one of the speakers. You're on a panel there talking about this very topic. So I guess that's part of the evangelization of the standard, right? Is generating awareness. What else are you hoping to get out of being on that panel?
Yeah, it's definitely creating more and more awareness. Gary and team are putting together a great content of agenda, an agenda of content for Chrysalis again this year, and we think it's another good audience to talk about the IDQL standard and how far we've come and the things we want to do in the future. The things we have on our roadmap, and so we'll be on a panel with Wade Ellery of Radiant Logic, who I've done, I guess, 2 or 3 webinars with in the past. Pam Dingle is going to be on there from head of standards from Microsoft, as well as Patrick from Ping Identity is going to be on the panel. So I think it'll be an interesting, definitely some different viewpoints to talk about there.
Yeah, I guess, probably one of the keys on getting a standard adopted these days is getting support, adoption of the standard by some of the what they call big tech, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, right?
Right.
I mean, that's kind of like when they're kind of buying into it, I would think that's, what can really make this thing take off.
It can, that's, it's obviously very helpful to get a big marquee vendor like that involved in the process. And, we've been having some of those conversations. But I said earlier, it's also important that the vendors hear about this from the customer side, from the enterprise side. And we're starting to see some of that happen. And then also, we've gotten quite a bit of coverage from Gartner. Speaking of the identity conference that I saw you at recently, IDQL is being tracked by the analyst community as well. TechVision, Gartner, Forrester, and others. And that's also helping to raise awareness of it from the enterprise customer side of things.
Yeah, I think one of the cool things also about the Chrysalis conference is, you had mentioned that Gartner conference back in 2006, and I think that was my first Gartner conference as well. That was when I was kind of like really getting into this industry. And I think I was also at the Burton Group conference that year. Put that aside. And Digital ID World. I was hitting all the conferences, man. I was going crazy. But one of the things I realized was identity and access management is a special industry. We're not just getting in the room and talking about technology, but there's also kind of a philosophy that plays into this, like, what is your identity? And where I see that really manifesting today is on this whole idea of like digital wallets and decentralized identity and the ability for a person to actually own their identity. There's several areas that are real interesting like that. You always see these new things cropping up, but to me, like, that could literally transform how this industry looks further on down the road. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We started talking about, we called it limited liability personas back at Burton Group. And I forget which Catalyst conference it was, but it was around that timeframe, 06, 07, that Bob Blakely gave a talk on this. And, another subject was the identity oracle, if you will, the limited release of attribute information about a person, given the context of a transaction or an interaction online. So yeah, we've been talking about these sorts of things for a long time. I think the biggest impediment really has been the business model of those properties that you're trying to interact with. Are they really going to give up, the ownership of all this data about you? I think has always and remains the biggest challenge. It's not the technology per se. There's, I think, some of the sovereign identity folks are taking a different technological approach to it. With limited liability personas, we were thinking of it more in a legal context, that you would actually incorporate some kind of pseudo identity of yourself so that you could have some of the same protections that a regular corporation has. So we were taking more of that angle rather than a technological one. But again, bottom line is I think the economic business model is still asymmetrical when it comes to an individual consumer, say, trying to limit how much information Amazon collects about them.
Yeah, absolutely. And, Jeff likes to use the quote, if the product is free, you're the product. And
Yes.
I was listening to a podcast. I wanted to get this out there, is Tools and Weapons with Brad Smith. I mean, I think he's got a really good podcast. There's a recent episode he did with Kara Swisher, who was like a journalist in kind of multiple eras of Silicon Valley, right? And she was talking a lot about how that, when Facebook was coming along and other platforms trying to figure out what the business model is and how can a business model succeed on advertising alone. Well, it's essentially selling people's private information or using that private information to target advertising toward that person.
Right. And we're seeing many examples of that business model in effect these days.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Gerry, it was great catching up with you. Hope we can have you back on at some point in the future and get some more updates on how things are going with the standards and the adoption and the growth of them. Anything that you'd want to leave the listeners with before we close out?
Well, I think you guys have been talking about all the conferences that you're attending these days. And it seems to be conference season in full force. So I'll be at Chrysalis next week, as you mentioned. Looking forward to connecting with some folks there. A lot of old friends I used to work with. But then taking a break for the holidays, and then things will get started again next year. Cloud Native Security Conference we're looking forward to, as well as RSA. I guess that's in April coming up next year.
Yeah, Gartner's in March next year.
Let's say it again. Sorry.
Gartner's in March next year.
That's right, and in Texas. So they finally moved out of Vegas. So glad to see that. Yeah. So
I'm
just
glad
looking forward
to see that too. I like me some Vegas, but this year I had to go twice within the same month, and I was like, that's way too much.
Yeah, I've got a pretty limited threshold for my tolerance of Vegas these days, but it's great to catch up with folks at these events. So definitely look forward to doing that and seeing you and Jeff out there again.
Yeah, we look forward to that as well. Thanks a lot, Gerry.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Bye, Jim.
Thanks for listening to the Identity at the Center podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe and visit us on the web at identityatthecenter.com.